long. It gives me 1.5 seconds of page. May I have 5 minutes, Mr. Mayor?
Well, we'll give you a little extra time. Your organization spends a lot of time paying attention to this.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. I'm Dan Handelman with Portland Cop Watch, and I'm not going to read the prepared remarks that I've handed in. I'm just going to kind of give broad brush stuff and hope maybe you'll have some follow-up questions. Our two major concerns about this report, as much as we support the recommendations and the work that the OIR has done and the transparency this provides, our two major concerns are, number one, that their solution to the problem of poor investigations that aren't as complete as the chief claims they are, or when they're working with the East County Crimes Team, is not to ask for more civilian investigations. We have the Independent Police Review Division. They have just gained a slightly more power to supposedly do independent investigations, though they still have to go through the Bureau to do it. Many people in the community have been asking for years for these shootings and deaths to be investigated by civilians and not by other police. And that should be a recommendation from OIR, and it's not. The other thing is that in their last report, they covered the Keaton Notice case. This time they talked about the issue of Mr. Johnson, the man who had a seatbelt off. What wasn't mentioned is who was in the back seat of the car. And can anybody in this room raise their hand if you've ever been ticketed for having a seatbelt off in the back seat of a car? Anybody? Okay. So my question is, once the car was pulled over, the driver didn't have insurance. It was a Cadillac with no taillights. Was it racial profiling that they tried to ticket the man in the back seat who happened to be a black man who then ran away from them when he realized that they knew he wasn't who he claimed to be? And they ended up dying because they thought he was faking being out of breath. Was it racial profiling? OIR Group did not ask that question, even though we asked them to pursue that question after the Keaton Notice case. Another issue that they raised, but they didn't really talk about a way to fix it, is the lack of follow-through afterwards, the lack of discipline, the lack of remedial action, they called it, for anything, redoing training, redoing policy stuff. That can be solved by the person who's been injured or their survivors having the ability to file an appeal with the Citizen Review Committee to the findings of the Police Review Board and the chief, which they can do in every other kind of police misconduct case except for shootings, which makes no sense at all, because then that way the CRC can help identify those issues and the Bureau can deal with them. And I do want to point out that in one of the disagreements, in one of the places where the Bureau said they agreed, actually, was that after a Police Review Board, what the OIR Group said is that the Professional Standards Division should go to the officer and say, you were found in policy or you were found out of policy, and then explain all the things that the board talked about, the training, the tactical decisions that were made that were good or bad, so there's a debriefing about the shooting. And the Bureau's response was, we already give them the finding the day of the hearing. But they didn't say anything about the debriefing. So they didn't answer the question. And there's quite a number of examples of that where the Bureau doesn't seem to have understood the recommendations, and I'm going to enumerate them in a longer analysis later. So we're also faced with this problem of how the OIR reports are generated in the first place. Historically, you may remember, when the IPR was first created, there was not going to be any look at shootings or deaths at all. And Jose Mejia was shot in a psychiatric hospital by Portland police, and the community demanded that there be a review of shootings. And what we ended up with is this outside agency coming in every year and looking at the shootings, and as the auditor described to you, it used to take a lot longer, and luckily we're almost caught up. We're at 2011, but it's 2014. These kinds of reviews should be happening as the investigation is happening. We shouldn't be waiting till after everything is closed down. We would get more thorough investigations if somebody was looking over their shoulders appropriately. So on that note, IPR has been going out to the scenes of these shootings and sitting in on the investigation since 2010, yet their name is only mentioned once in this entire report and has nothing to do with the investigations. It has to do with a task force that was set up that they weren't invited to be part of. And I asked the OIR if they could include, and they said they would next time, how many times IPR has pushed the Bureau to ask more questions. How effective is it for us to have this independent agency involved in these investigations if the Bureau is not doing thorough investigations still. I also really want to point out that when Mr. Johnson died, one of the things that happened was he was already in a police car. he had run away from the original site. Other police officers followed the cops to that site, put him in their car, and then in the process of transferring him from one car to the other, there was a huge struggle, which may have led to his death. And I don't understand why, once he was in the police car, why didn't that police car just take him to the hospital or to jail, which they're trying to do. Can I have another minute, Mr.
Go ahead,
Kang?
sure.
Thank you very much. And one of the other issues that you've talked about here today was the commander's memo. And while I understand why it's an important exercise for the supervisor of the officer involved in the shooting to go through and pull this all to one place, if you eliminate that step, then the community concern that the commander, who has already recommended a finding, gets then to vote on the police review board, and this has a second bite at the apple, we would not be concerned about that anymore, because then the commander will not be having a second bite. So I think you should strongly consider that recommendation to eliminate that step and find another way to do it. And the very long, protracted discussion you had about the 48-hour rule, we really want to see this go away. You know, the community's been talking about this for many years, and we have discussed before, Commissioner Fritz, the issue about garrity and transactional immunity. And what transactional immunity means is that if you compel the officer to say something, even if you get that information from some other place, you can't use it to prosecute that because you compelled that from them. So you could, in theory, separate the two investigations, have the administrative investigation only ask questions about their tactics, which has nothing to do with their criminal liability, or since we have seen 120 deadly force incidents in our 23 years of Portland Cop Watch, and only one indictment in the entire history of the Portland Police for a person who mistakenly loaded live rounds in a beanbag shotgun, maybe we could just not worry so much about the indictment, because it's never happening anyway. So let's just go ahead and compel the testimony on the day of the thing, on the day of the shooting, and we'll find out if the officer is out of policy right away.
Thanks.